What really makes a great leader? It's not just about having the right strategy or managing tasks effectively. It's about understanding people. In this episode of De-Stress Your Business, I'm joined by leadership expert William C. Davis to explore what it truly means to lead a team. With over 38 years of experience spanning corporate America, the military, and government, William shares the powerful lessons that he's learned about fostering trust, building ownership, and navigating the human side of leadership. We talk about how to move from managing tasks to inspiring people, why emotional intelligence and self-awareness are more important than ever, and how leaders can adapt to meet the expectations of a new generation of employees, especially Gen Z. If you want to build stronger teams, develop as a leader, and create a culture where people actually want to show up and do great work, then this episode is a must listen. Welcome to De-Stress Your Business, the podcast where we show you how to get incredible results in your business without constant stress. I'm Alexis Kingsbury, a serial entrepreneur and founder at AirManual, and I'm joined by William C. Davis. Welcome to the podcast, William.
Good morning, Alexis. How are you doing?
Yes, fantastic and great to have you here. And for
Thank you.
those that don't know you well yet, perhaps we could start with a bit about your background and particularly the kind of leadership challenges that you've helped solve.
Well, I've, as you mentioned, just retired after 38 years in corporate America, mainly 38 years in senior leadership roles in Fortune 500 companies. So the reason I retired was over the last few years, I've really seen a change in leadership across corporate America, and it's not good. And so what I really wanted to do the last, 5, 7, 10 years of my career, I wanted to start giving back to the newer generation of leaders or those who want to be leaders, because there's a right way to lead and there's a wrong way to lead. And the right way to lead makes life, to your point, a lot less stressful. And it's something that can be done. I mean, it's not difficult, right? It's a process and it's a work, but it's something that is valuable and it's something that can be done. And I wanted to be able to help folks be able to, excel in that area.
Fantastic. Love that. And from your perspective, when you talk about some of the wrong way to lead and some of the perhaps concerning leadership that you've seen that's led you to this conclusion, what are some of the perhaps the behaviors or the beliefs, the mindsets, etc., that you've seen that are on that wrong way to lead side?
Well, we have a lot of the general ones, right? First off, one of the things that concerns me is people believe that leadership, management, and being a boss are interchangeable, and they're not. They're three absolutely separate disciplines. I don't even like to talk about boss because usually that's an attitude that does not succeed, and you lose your people very quickly. Not all managers are leaders, but all managers can be leaders if they desire to. And then leaders may also be managers, but I hope to focus them on the fact that leadership is the job, right? That is what you focus on as opposed to the A to Z, getting from A to Z. So one of the challenges that I've really seen is we have, particularly over the last 25 years or so with the advent of technology, we have become a people that do not integrate well together on a personal basis because we use what? Cell phones, we use text messaging, we use Zoom, we use, my team, all these things that, when I was growing up and I was first beginning in my career, we did all in person. So the interpersonal dynamic that we had is totally different than what we have today. And then you add on the pandemic that we had around 5 years ago, you've got a generation of newer leaders coming out of college, beginning their career, that really lost 5 years in a very critical phase of life that would have allowed them to really start building dynamic relationships and understanding how do I deal with people in various situations. So we've got to get back to that because, again, the criticality of relationships as to my leadership success is, to me, the biggest item.
Sure. And so bring that to life for me. Perhaps if you could share an example of either a leader that you've worked with or something you've experienced or witnessed to kind of demonstrate what those behaviors can look like, and the impact that then had.
When I worked for Bank of America, and I worked for them almost 25 years, a lot of the leadership that I saw within, at least my division of the organization centered around me,
Mm.
and it's not. I mean, when you determine to be a leader, it does not become about you anymore. It's all about your people. And
Agreed.
it's all about their success and building them up and helping them grow. But I'll give you a perfect example. We went on a merger and acquisition, period of time there for about 10 years. And every time we purchased someone, we would have to give report outs to both our leadership and the leadership of the organization we bought. And it was my practice to, as much as possible, always allow my people to give the report outs. They did the work, they deserved the credit. It also gave them not only good exposure, but good experience. So they continued to grow in confidence and so forth. I caught so much flack for that because no, you need to be doing. Well, why do I need to be doing it? I'm not doing the work. Well, because you're making us look bad. Well, how am I making you look bad? Well, if you let your people do the reports out, we have to let our people do the reports out. Well, they didn't want that because of why? They wanted the exposure. They wanted the pats on the back. And that's fine, but again, as a leader, the success of my people should be the greatest accomplishment in my career. And if they pass me by, great. I'm happy for them. That's what I want them to do. And so, to me, again, that's the attitude we got to get back to: is making sure that we feel like our people are the most important aspect of the work that's done.
I really like that, and I think it's interesting because that might hint towards some of the ways in which we can grow great leaders, perhaps with a younger generation. Because
Yes.
one of the things that I see, even earlier today, I was talking to the leader of a large accountancy firm, and they were reflecting a frustration that over the last 20 years of recruitment and managing people, that they felt like they'd seen less ambition in newer recruits and the working population generally than what they had around them 20, 30 years ago.
Right.
And so as a result, they kind of felt this frustration of, so where's our succession planning? Who are going to be
Yeah.
the leaders of the business and so
Yeah.
on? Because they're not attracted to the roles that we have. They don't want to work as crazy hours, and they're not motivated by, they don't seem to have this ambition and so on. And it's interesting because it makes me wonder whether for that particular dimension of how you lead, actually there's an opportunity there to say, well, actually that generation that you're referring to, maybe they're not as interested in the crazy levels of financial success they might get, which, by incidentally, particularly for this accountancy industry, the amount that you can get is lower than it used to be and so on. But also, actually, maybe they are more motivated by team success. And that's something I certainly see, is that attitude towards avoiding me management or me leadership. Actually, much more of them are motivated by doing something as a collective and achieving something great together, rather than particularly taking credit themselves. So that might be giving us an example of how you can leverage that better with more sort of modern or young generation leadership. But coming to that point you made earlier around your concern around perhaps the lack of experience for and opportunities for experience of leadership, and perhaps over reliance on technology, etc. Is there another example that you can perhaps share of, a leader or an example of someone that should be leading more effectively, and you observed that wasn't the case, that would kind of illustrate that point more? Because I'm always conscious that with generalizations, it can always feel like, is that true? Are we actually seeing that? Is that, or is it just, is it a classic thing that as we get older, we all look backwards and say, oh, kids today?
Yeah, that's true. And I'll be honest with you. I mean, as a younger leader, I was very selfish, right? It was I
Right.
wanted to make sure that I was out there, and so I could understand the mindset. But I think, to your point, some of it is based upon the industry. I have seen in technology in particular that you have a lot of people that have the mind for technology, have the ability to really understand leading trends and so forth. And they've got that mind that can tell you what we're going to do and how we're going to do it and why we're going to do it. But then to actually lead people to, down that path, it's difficult for them because that's not the way they're wired. Right. And so, I saw that a lot with the retail organization that I just retired from. Is got a lot of great smarts in regards to what we're doing, how we're doing, but couldn't lead people to water if they were dying of thirst. And so, yeah, that was one area. But I've also seen other areas, financial industry. I was in that for a long time, and what I saw there were a lot of people that had leadership capabilities,
Mm.
but never could separate themselves from, again, the what's in it for me attitude to where they could lift their people up. And so, again, I always tell people when they talk about wanting to be a leader, I said the first thing you have to do is have a self awareness that you are, again, no longer the focus. You are no longer the focus. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't continue to learn. That doesn't mean you don't continue to do things and be successful, right? I'm not saying sacrifice your career, but what I'm saying is that you have to be self-aware enough that you're now not the focal point and it's your team. And I think when they do that, one of the attitude changes that they have to have is understanding that their team is not their competition.
Mm.
Team's not your competition. Your team is a complement to you. And so that is one of the biggest mindsets that I've seen people struggle to get over is not making their team their competition and not worrying about somebody bypassing me. You know, I you know, I have two kids. They're both in their 30s. And, I've worked with technology for my whole career, but they could run circles around me, from a technology perspective. And I expect that, right? Because they've had different upbringing, they've had different exposure, different experience. And as a leader, you have to understand that your people are going to have that same. I always look at it this way, Alexis. Leadership relationships are a lot like a marriage. You've got two people that come together who have X number of years of various exposures, experiences, upbringings, and now you're trying to mesh those, into one and hope it cohesively works together. The neat thing about it is you hopefully have 10, 20, 30, 40 years to work on it, right? And really perfect it. In building leadership relationships with your team, one, you don't have that necessarily that time frame, but you're not just talking one-on-one relationships. Now you're talking one to then the team, whatever that size is, right? So I, as a leader, have to build those relationships with each individual. I then have to build the relationship with the team. And then I also have to build the relationship where the team dynamic, they're able to get along together and, again, to your point, support each and work together.
Yeah, I really like that. And so, like, when we think about that analogy of trying to help that leader tackle a very complex picture of how you work together, and as you say, I like the analogy against the marriage. You've got a shorter amount of time and more complexity in terms of moving parts, and yet, as you know, as we know from statistics, there are plenty of people that struggle to make those marriages work, and so on. And of course, there's various points in the marriage example where the people involved wonder, is it that I'm doing something wrong, or we're doing something wrong about how we manage this, or
Right.
was the recruitment process the issue and I've got the wrong person? I need to
Yeah.
make a change.
Yeah.
And so, and that's a common issue I see in leadership, right? That issue of, is it me? Is it the way I'm leading? Is it the way the team's working? Or have I got a person issue and it's I haven't got the right member of my team? When you're advising leaders, typically what's the journey that you take them on from, particularly if they're perhaps struggling with those mindset challenges, if they're experiencing some of the challenges around feeling like, they're not, their role in the business is not
Mhm.
what they'd like. Maybe they struggle with, I worry that some people don't really respect me as a leader, or maybe it's the other end, like people seem to be scared of them and they don't like that that's who they feel like they've had to become, or perhaps they're just feeling ineffective. where do you usually start on that journey with them?
Yeah, I first start by asking them, how well do you know your people, right? And I'm not talking about in regards to how well they work. How well do you know them on a personal level? Because the most important part to being able to get people to buy into your leadership is they can tell whether you're genuine, either whether you're fake. And if I am genuine and I can and show them that I am invested in their success, not just work wise, but in life in general. They, they'll move mountains for you.
Mm.
And so what I, first advise is don't try to get to know your people in an office setting,
Okay.
because when you bring them into a boardroom, when you bring them to their office, into your office, and you try to establish that relationship, they are still at a disadvantage because they still see you as, the boss, or,
Mm.
the leader, or whatever. So what I've always tried to do through my career is I've tried to build relationships with my people in an arena which makes them comfortable. And so I'll just give you an example. I had a young man when I worked for Bank of America. Just he was an awesome kid, and he was just 23, 24, 25, somewhere around there, but he was nervous as could be, and always was worried about, am I doing a good enough job? Am I going to get fired? I'm like, I just hired you. I'm not going to fire you, you know. But what I had to do with him, I said, okay, look, what do you like to do out of the office? And he loved to golf. So I said, okay, we're going to take an afternoon off and we're going to go golf. And so, and back then I still golfed. So, that was okay. And so we went golfing and I let him drive the cart, which again made him nervous, thinking that he was going to wreck it or whatever. So the first 3 or 4 holes were really tense, and I wasn't making any headway. So the next hole that I teed off on, man, I shanked a shot out in the woods that I'm sure not they still haven't found. And I started making fun of myself, right? I said, well, I hope you understand I'm going easy on you, and just self-deprecating in the whole bit. And the whole aura changed. He saw that I was able to kid with him, that I was able to make fun of myself, that, you know, I was more than just about business.
Mm.
And I really wanted to get to know him, have fun with him, and so forth. And I'll tell you what, the rest of that round, you'd have thought we'd known each other our whole lives. I mean, we just talked about everything. And, you know, from that point on, we had just an absolute great relationship. He never was worried about coming and talking to me about, concerns or ideas or whatever. And I followed that pattern for almost my whole career, because to me, that's the only way I got people to understand, look, we win together, we lose together. And you have to understand, I'm as invested in you as you are in yourself. And I want you to succeed. And I'm going to do everything I can to support you. So that's the first place I ask them to analyze. How well do you know your people? What's
Mm.
your relationship with them? And do they feel like that you've got their back? Because if people don't feel like you got their back, they're not going to stick their neck out for you. It's just not going to happen.
Nice. I think that's so strong for a number of reasons, because I think that definitely my experience has been that if you've got that positive relationship, and I like the way you describe it, that they feel like you've got their back,
Yeah.
it allows you to circumnavigate so many issues
Yeah.
just generally.
Yeah.
When there's a miscommunication, a worry, something else, something going on in their personal life that's showing up at work, whatever,
Yeah.
them feeling able to talk to you about that stuff and raise that and so on is probably one of the most crucial things. And often one of the ways in which, I've helped other clients solve it is by making sure they've got good management practices in place, like regular one-to-ones, which are
Right.
super helpful and in some ways are trying to potentially force traditionally bad managers to spend time talking to their team. And we're even prescriptive on, as part of your one-to-one process, would recommend that one of the first questions you ask is, how are things going overall? Like,
Yeah.
how are things going in your life? To try and get them to create that connection, because as you say, until you have that, it makes everything so much harder. And I love that, you found that way through golf in that example, to invest in that relationship to improve that, and so on, which I think is strong. And also I think important that I see a lot of managers and leaders worry that, oh, but if I spend time with my team outside of work, then does that either make me not look like the boss, and that, oh yeah, I'm just one of you guys, and so on. But clearly the way that you've described this and demonstrated that story, that doesn't feel like the shift in that dynamic. Or that they feel like, the boss taking someone out to go do those things is, has become almost a cliche in
Yeah.
TV shows, etc., that they would worry that it might go in a negative direction and that everyone's scared of them, and so on. So I see a lot of people just avoiding spending that time either outside work or even inside work. Like avoiding having the one-to-ones with their employees because they're worried that the team will either share something personal that they then feel ill-equipped to deal with, or that they won't know how to engage with that person socially. So I think you're right to highlight that. For those managers, leaders, any sort of advice that you'd provide on like how to take that further forward?
Well, when we were doing those mergers and acquisitions, we were on the road like 75% of the time. And I always had my team with me. And I made sure every night that we went to dinner together as a group, right? And to the best we could, we didn't talk about business. We just talked about life, talked about family, talked about things were going on. And so they saw that I was treating everybody the same. One of my core principles is you will not throw somebody under the bus. When you work for me, you're not going to do that. We don't do that, right? And so with that and the way I built relationships and then carried it over into our after hours, together time, they saw that I again was one of them at times. But then when we were in the office, I mean, I was very businesslike and I made the decisions. And, again, I offered or asked for opinions and asked for, better ways to do things and always challenged them to do. But I made the decision and they understood that I, again, was the one that was in charge. And there's a way of doing that without coming out as an arrogant person or as browbeating individuals, right? Again, because if you're consistent in the way that you treat everybody, and not just in the office but outside the office, then there's a respect there that grows for you, and they can understand. Hey, he's the boss. I understand that, but yet he's also you know interacting with us because he cares. And so I would encourage, those who are leaders or want to be leaders, you know, you have to be careful in drawing that line of how far you go in getting involved in somebody's personal life, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you can get involved in their personal life to the extent that where your company offers resources to help them because they have challenges or whatever, help them get hooked up with that, right? Know about that. Make sure that they feel like that they are supported
Yeah.
and they're not going it alone.
Nice. Yeah, really good. And so let's take that manager, that leader who we've gotten to a point now where they say, yeah, I feel like I know my team now well. I've spent time individually with them. I've spent time team dinners, etc. I've made sure that I've spent some time talking about not work things, and
Yeah.
therefore and been authentic and shared a bit about me so that they understand that. But at the same time, in a work environment, I make sure that I'm then very professional and that people understand my role, and I'm making decisions. What's typically the next thing that you'd say that people then either struggle with or that they need to make sure that they're implementing to maximize the results they get as a leader?
Well, I have always thought that it was important to help your team understand why you're doing something, right?
Mm-hmm.
One of the challenges that I see so often is why are we doing this? Well, because the upper echelon says we need to do it. Okay, but why, right?
Yeah.
Why? And what you find when you are able to explain the why of what you're doing, people are then able to create the solution in a lot better manner, right? I need to do X. Okay, why? Well, because this allows us to do, da 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 da. Well, okay, great. But here's something I read, or here's something I saw, or here's something I heard, that makes that process better than what we're actually looking at. So, you have to, again, if you are able to explain the why, your team is invested in the solution. And when somebody's invested in the solution, they try harder, they work harder, they think harder, and they get more creative.
Really like that. I think, and that's a useful exercise for any leader, is to spend
Yeah,
more time on that. What is the why behind what
right.
we're doing? And then how can I better communicate that? Because
There you go.
I agree. I see that a lot. And in fact, I see it in general. I'd say that pretty much every leader, myself included, should be and could be spending more time on the why, both in terms of defining it myself to even get my own head around it, but also sharing it. But I see, particularly with what we might class as sort of bad management, isn't quite right. It's like management or leadership where those leaders are finding that it's frustrating and that they're not getting the results. Typically, one of the common things I see is a frustration that the team won't just do what you told them to do.
Right.
And I see it particularly where you've got a leader who says, oh, come back to the example I had where I spoke to a leader earlier today who was talking about how the frustration of newer generation not just not working in the way that we used to, and so on,
Yeah.
and seeing that sense of, well, I've told them what I want them to do, why can't they just get on and do it? And actually, even if you give them guidance, even if you give them the process, the training, etc., they still need that why if you want them to get behind it and be empowered and interested, inspired, etc. But also, as you say, like, they'll find ways of achieving it faster, better, and also not make silly mistakes that are easy to otherwise. For If we can bring that to life, though, for people, because I think that there are too many leaders that think, oh, no, I totally tell them why. Oh, yeah. I'm really clear with the why. Are you able to perhaps share an example of either an example of a leader who didn't do a good job of sharing it, and or an example of a leader of what you would describe as being, okay, this is the level that you need to be aiming for?
Well, I think you start at the very beginning of a project, right? With explaining the why, so everybody understands that they're on the same path, and that the goal or the end point is the same. And I think that's one of the challenges that I've seen is leaders oftentimes pick favorites, right? And they
Mm.
give them a little bit more of the detail than they give everybody else, and then just hope it, trickles down to everybody to understand. So what I always encourage people is that, when you have a big event that you guys are working on, you bring everybody together, and even if you whiteboard it out, just make sure everybody understands what we're doing, why we're doing it, how we need to get there. And that's a great time for people to brainstorm, at
Mm.
least initially. And then don't then just turn it over to them to just say, okay, go run with it. Keep making sure that through rechecks that we're still on the same path, we're still on the same, reaching toward the same goal. What I always like to explain to people, or even did myself, is we would do periodic check-ins as a team to understand, okay guys, where are we at, what have we done to this point, where are we at, of what we've done up to this point, what would you have done differently, right? Because I think one of the big challenges is we always talk about lessons learned and then we do them and then never use them again, right? I mean, it's just like, okay, why did we do this exercise? But what I've often found is that in doing that, doing these periodic checks as a team, you actually find people that say, you know what, we probably should have talked to someone in HR, you know, and oh, well, I did talk to somebody in HR, and here's what they told us, right? That communication didn't occur. So again, make sure everybody's on the same page going in. Continue to lead the process of getting to the end goal by making sure that the team has periodic check-ins. Don't assume that they're talking, right? And even if they're talking, don't assume that they are productive conversations, because again, everybody's got deadlines, everybody's got work to do. They yeah, 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 okay, fine, go on. Make sure that it's productive. And what I always, some of the most fun I ever had in my career was I'd have the team together and we'd be bouncing ideas off, and I'd just listen,
Mm.
right? And watch the camaraderie, watch the interaction, watch their brains thinking, and encourage, hey guys, that's great. But what about this? And throw periodic roadblocks in there and see what they thought, or how they worked around them. You can gain so much knowledge about your team by doing that. But stay engaged, by making sure that everybody continues on the same plane, and has the same direction.
Nice. Yeah, indeed. And are there perhaps a specific project or a specific process in your career where it essentially fell flat because the team's mindset wasn't aligned, and what went wrong? How did you approach that and fix that?
Oh boy, do I want to admit that on TV? Oh gosh, yeah. I mean, there were times where I got lazy, and just we've done this so many times and just assumed, right, that we were doing it just like we always did. And we would there were times that we would do a merger, or do conversion, data conversion, and we forget a file, right?
Hmm.
Or we would assume that a program that worked for a previous acquisition was going to automatically work for this one, right? But yeah, there were many changes you had to make just because of the way the data was being derived. So yeah, it happened a couple of times, and luckily we found it early enough that we were able to make adjustments and retest, and not affect the end result. But I it just I that was the only time I ever assumed, right? And again, the one of the reasons I did that was because I was blessed to have a 90% retention rate of my teams my whole career. And particularly during that 10-year period of time, I had probably 90+% of my team that stayed with me that whole period. And they were so good, and they were so smart, and they were so, well versed in what each of them did and how they did it, and when they needed to talk, and that I just, I kind of took a back seat, and I shouldn't have. Yeah.
Okay. And so in one of those examples, or in that example, like the data file kind of missing and so on, what would you say is the kind of early warning sign? And particularly, I'm interested in the action that you took at that point, because often what I'll see in teams is where perhaps they have some mistake that's made, perhaps a particularly major one, and that realization dawns that things aren't right.
Mm.
And it's, as a leader, how do you avoid going to the very tempting, oh, I'll just, put my sleeves up and I'll do it instead because my team are making mistakes, and you take responsibility. Yeah, I've not set them up right, but then you end up stuck doing the doing. Like, how did you identify those early warning signs, and then what action did you take?
Well, the example I gave you, the early warning sign, was that a bucket of dollars that we were needing to bring over wasn't there. It was in a different system, and we didn't realize it at the time. So that was a pretty early on clue that we missed something. But my team would tell you very quickly that I wasn't the smartest brain in the room, right? So they weren't ever going to turn anything over to me and say, "Hey, you do it." They had the skills, they had the ability, but again, I used it as an opportunity for us to, again, reinforce and grow our connection, because I didn't overreact,
Hmm.
right? You know, with the exception of certain surgeries, everything's fixable, right? Everything's fixable, and it doesn't ever help to overreact, blow up, cause a scene, because I have yet to ever work with anybody, Alexis, that intentionally does something wrong. right? It's always a situation of, hey, we live and we learn. We grow, we work, and we fix things and go on. So, my philosophy was, if it's your mistake, you own it, you fix it. If you need help, hey, we'll jump in and we'll help you. And that was a great camaraderie that I had on my teams, is that, boy, the folks jumped in, without hesitation, and a lot of times without even being asked, just because they had a teammate that was hurting or teammate that was struggling, and they wanted to help them, lift them up. So, again, if you make the mistake, you own it. We'll support you. We'll do whatever we can to help, you correct it, but you don't pass it off to somebody else.
Yeah, nice. And earlier we talked about some of the steps that a leader can take, particularly perhaps if they're struggling around getting performance out of their team. And we started with getting to know your team and building more of that relationship. Then being much clear about the why. What are you actually expecting from them, both at a high level in terms of what are we optimizing for, but then also when a new process, a project, even a task, what is the outcome that you're looking for, what actually matters. If we were to take that further, because in fact we've just then been talking about how do you tackle mistakes, and when things don't happen the way that you want them to, making sure that rather than just taking it back off them, you're actually supporting them in how are we going to tackle this together and what support do you need. And I think that's really nice. For leaders that you've worked with where perhaps they struggle with the emotional intelligence of how to be a good leader, or they are perhaps struggling with, they still feel like they're getting pushback from their team, perhaps they're getting the that's not my job kind of mindset, or issues of handovers between teams or individuals, what else would you then recommend that leader consider?
Well, that's a great question. I've seen that. There's sometimes that you work with people and you just have to cut ties with them, right? I mean, you have the approach. It works with 95% of the people, and there's a 5% there that just they don't buy in. So I think that's always, hanging out there of how far do I go to try to get everybody to buy in. And if somebody gets to the point you've done everything in your bag of disciplines to get them as a part of the team and to buy in, and it's still not working, sometimes you just have to cut ties. But I think where you still have struggles, it never hurts to ask other people, hey, where is the disconnect? I mean, you know, and it may be going to somebody that you have a great relationship and say, okay, I'm kind of struggling here in this area. Don't name names, but in this area, is there something that you're seeing that I'm missing that I could do better or I could, change? And a lot of times they'll say, yeah, you need to do this, right? And there are times that the old-fashioned way of just going straight to the source, the person that you're having struggles with, and saying, okay, what's the challenge between us? Why are we not gelling? What do I need to do differently? What are you upset with? Whatever. And then, to the extent that you can, do what you can, but don't let them off the hook on making changes themselves. They need to do a little bit of self-awareness check to see, is it my attitude? Is it my, thinking I'm always right when, maybe I need to be quiet and listen and learn. And so I think there's two different approaches to try to figure out where's the challenge: the direct approach to the person that you're dealing with or that having an issue with, but then other members of the team that you have a great relationship, and just say, hey, what am I missing here? Is there something that you would tell me, hey, make a change?
I really like that. It makes me think of, so one of my software businesses, Spider Gap, is a 360-degree feedback tool
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
that's commonly used by lots of organizations around the world to help commonly leaders, although it's in many organizations it's used on everyone or a large set or whatever, but commonly helping leaders get that self-awareness. And I think that I'm reminded, but that often I've read and observed that self-awareness is one of the things that is most important for that leadership development. And it's interesting that that's what you're referring to when I asked about how can you improve your emotional intelligence, how can you tackle issues where you're those stubborn issues that you're struggling, is to get that feedback and that understanding.
Yeah.
And it's getting that peer feedback on what's going on, getting the feedback from your direct reports. And I really like that point around that doesn't necessarily mean that therefore you then have to make all the changes.
Right.
Just the fact that you understand that there's a gap or that you understand someone else's perception is the point, not that they prescriptively are going to tell you exactly what your personal development plan should be. That's for then you to decide based on playing to your strengths and what you're seeing and how the differences with team members. And I think that's really interesting. I like your point around actually then working with that individual, like if we're talking about someone that you're leading, if they've got feedback for you, working with them to get the best out of you in some ways. That's one of the things that I've seen. Traditionally, I really struggled with delegation many years ago and worked on it a lot. And as a result, it's kind of funny that now that's something that I tackle through one of my businesses with AirManual. But that's because I've had to learn how to address something that was a underlying weakness in me as a leader. But it's interesting that those conversations that I've had with direct reports of mine in the past who would say, yeah, you need to be handing more to me. Yes, it needs to be on my radar that, yes, I need to be letting go. But also one of the things I was doing is coaching them on how to get stuff off me,
Right.
giving me more visibility of what's currently on their plate and what are some of the activities or responsibilities or skills they're looking to develop so that I can then get better clarity on hand those over. And I think that's a really great point that you're making there around it doesn't mean that it all becomes on you as the leader to then solve every single thing. And in fact, that which reminds me that I think a lot of leaders default to control or problem solving rather than delegation, and certainly that used to be the case for me. Is there a particular question or tip that you've got, that a pattern a pattern interrupt that you would suggest that a leader can use or ask themselves in that moment to course correct?
Well, I've always found it interesting that people are so rigid toward constructive criticism, right? I was the worst, when again I was younger. I mean, people would say, you might do that. And oh no, I'm not going to do that, because I was perfect, right? It's like, you always learn. You're always learning. Leadership is always learning, always adapting, right, to the environmental changes that you're going through. Again, how you led in the 90s, how you led in the 2000s, how you led through the pandemic, all different. How you lead today is different. So that's a constant adjustment. And so what I always tell people is, okay, just step back, think about how you handle first your people. You made a great point earlier about one-on-ones. So many times when I hear people criticizing their leaders, it's because they don't feel like they're getting anything out of the one-on-one sessions, right? The leader either makes the one-on-one session about themselves or, anything other than what that's that person's time to come in and talk to you, right? It's their time. Let them talk. And so, when you get to the point where you start struggling with your people, it's usually because they're communicated something to you and you're not getting it. You're not hearing it. And so you need to step back and say, okay, how am I actually dealing with my people? Am I hearing them? Am I being active towards the things they're bringing me and doing something with it? Or, when I talk to them this week, in 2 weeks, are we still going to be talking about the same thing because nothing's changed? I've not taken any action and so forth. So, again, all of it to me, Alexis, is going back and just looking at yourself and how am I doing in my responsibilities as a leader, right? And making sure again I can do the changes, make the changes that I need to make.
Nice. Fantastic. Love that. Right, I'm going to need to move us to some quick fire questions now
All right.
as we start to run out the clock or run out of time. So, why do you think someone should want to be a leader?
Well, I think the biggest thing is you like to help people and help them succeed. Humans are naturally drawn to relationships and naturally drawn to good relationships. They want that reinforcement. They want that connection. And so that's always been the big trigger for me is I want to be able to help people and make them happy and do the things that they want to do.
Nice. What one thing causes most stress for your clients?
Turnover, the inability to retain their people. And again, you talk about the cost of having to replace someone, and it's incrementally higher depending upon their experience and longevity and so forth. But retention is the biggest issue for them.
And what do you think is the main reason that they struggle with retention?
Well, it's the very reason that I got into this is U.S. News World Report Harris poll came out in November of 2023 that said 78% of the respondents said we have a leadership crisis in corporate America. So, leadership needs to understand that their people are craving something and are missing it. And we need to tune into what that is.
Love that. What do you enjoy most in your business or personal life?
Oh, my family. Yeah, easily my family. My two kids, my daughter's still close to us. My son's in Alabama, but I traveled so much for about a 20-year period of time that, my wife and I are just kind of starting to enjoy our time together. I just retired 2 months ago, so it's we're kind of enjoying just being around and sitting around eating, drinking coffee, and talking in the morning.
Nice. What's the one thing you want business leaders to take from this episode?
Well, leadership is deceptively simple, but it takes work and it takes a desire to be a leader. If I don't desire to be a leader, I'm not going to be a good leader. And we've got to do a better job of determining whether somebody's got leadership potential or not. One of the key things that I always did, Alexis, was before I determined if I wanted to move somebody into a leadership role or not, I saw their interaction with their family because that's a true sense of how they really deal with people. If they treated their wife and their children horribly, I don't want them as a leader. Because if they are going to treat people that they love like that, I can't even imagine what they would treat people that, work for them like.
Fantastic. Love it. Well, thank you so much, William, for sharing your insights in this episode. And to everyone else, thank you so much for listening. If you found this episode useful, please do share it on social media. Go to Apple Podcasts and leave a 5-star review with a comment. Even if it's just one word, makes a huge difference. And I'll give you triple points if you mention your favorite episode. I do read them all and I really, really appreciate it. So it makes a really big difference to the podcast as well. But otherwise, until next time, have fun.